Hello all the serial pagloos, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to review Anupama. Anupama was not just another daily soap on Indian television, it became an emotion for millions of women across Indian households. At a time when most ITV shows revolved around exaggerated drama, glamorous villain and repetitive family politics, Anupama arrived with something surprisingly simple yet deeply powerful: the invisible pain of an ordinary housewife. The show connected instantly because Anupama was not portrayed as a perfect heroine in a cinematic way. She was soft spoken, emotionally exhausted, underappreciated, and constantly taken for granted. Exactly like countless women watching the show from their living rooms, she spent her life cooking, cleaning, sacrificing, adjusting, and keeping the family together, yet received almost no respect in return. Her efforts were considered duties, not love. That realism became the soul of the show. Her husband Vanraj represented a kind of, emotionally neglectful partner many viewers recognized immediately. He looked down upon her, mocked her lack of education and confidence, and constantly made her feel inferior. He never truly valued her emotional labor or devotion. Instead of support, she received criticism. Instead of affection, she received humiliation, and that betrayal became even more painful because Anupama still continued caring for the family selflessly. The family dynamics made the show hit even harder emotionally. Her mother-in-law constantly taunted her and treated her like she was never enough. Her children, despite loving her in some ways, often overlooked her sacrifices and unintentionally belittled her existence. Everyone depended on her, yet nobody really saw her. That emotional invisibility is what made audiences, especially women and homemakers, feel deeply connected to her character. What truly made Anupama revolutionary for ITV was that it shifted the focus from saving the family at all costs to a woman finally realizing her own worth. The show told women that devotion should not mean losing your identity. It questioned the culture where housewives are expected to give endlessly while asking for nothing in return. It gave emotional validation to women who had silently normalized neglect for years. The beauty of the show was that it didn't begin with rebellion or revenge. It began with pain, self-doubt, and years of emotional conditioning that made Anupama's gradual journey towards self-respect feel authentic rather than dramatic. Viewers celebrated every small moment where she spoke for herself, herself, or rediscovered her individual identity. And her individuality, the writing, the emotional dialogues, relatable situations, and the actors' performance turned the show into a massive household phenomenon. Women did not just watch Anupama, they saw themselves in her. Mothers, daughters, homemakers, even elderly women felt represented in a way ITV had really not done that something like this before. Of course, like many long-running ITV shows, Anupama later became more dramatic and stretched over time, but its initial impact remains undeniable. It opened conversations about emotional neglect inside families, unpaid domestic labor, toxic marriages, and silent suffering of homemakers. It proved that a story about an ordinary woman's dignity could become more powerful than extravagant fiction. Massively successful, it also began following the typical ITV formula: stretched conflict endlessly to maintain the TRPs. One major issue people point out is the way the show handled infidelity. Manraj and Kavya's extramarital relationship was initially shown as morally hurtful and destructive to the family, which made sense narratively. The emotional damage caused to Anupama and the children were deeply emphasized. However, over time, the affair slowly became normalized within the story. The family that once strongly opposed it eventually accepted it, and Vanraj marrying Kavya became, treated almost an inevitable transition rather than something with lasting emotional consequences. Similarly, Parutosh cheating Kinjal during her pregnancy disturbed many viewers because it repeated the same pattern. The betrayal was serious, emotionally cruel and traumatic, yet eventually the storyline moved towards, forgiveness and reintegration into the family structure. For many viewers, this created the feeling that the show repeatedly condemned cheating emotionally but ultimately softened its consequences practically. That contradiction frustrated audience because the show originally positioned itself as socially aware and emotionally mature. When betrayals repeatedly end with everything becomes normal again, it can unintentionally send mixed messages about accountability, respect, and emotional damage within relationships. At the same time, the show explored progressive themes that ITV traditionally avoided. Especially Anupama remarrying Anuj later in her life. Her relationship with Anuj represented emotional healing, companionship, and the idea that women deserve love and respect even after divorce. That arc resonated strongly with the audience because ITV rarely gave middle aged female protagonists a second chance at happiness without judgment, but eventually that emotional freshness started getting buried under excessive melodrama. Now, one of the most common complaints is that the show thrives almost entirely on chaos, constant screaming, misunderstandings, emotional blackmail, family members insulting each other, repetitive separation, and endless suffering. Instead of emotional realism, the narrative often feels emotionally exhausting. Every episode needs a new conflict, new humiliation, a new betrayal, or a new breakdown to keep viewers hooked. And that's where many long viewers feel disappointed. The show that once gave voice to the silent, emotional pain now often amplifies toxicity for entertainment rather than healing or growth. Many storylines reset into more fighting and emotional trauma. Characters rarely evolve permanently because peace would end the drama cycle. Anupama became popular initially because it gave Indian television something emotionally refreshing. A middle aged woman beginning life again after years of invisibility. Instead of showing youth, glamour, or fantasy, the show focused on a homemaker rediscovering herself after dedicating 25 years entirely to her family. That journey resonated deeply with audiences because the firsts in Anupama's life felt emotionally meaningful. Her first salary, her first flight, opening her dance academy, starting her kitchen business, stepping outside the house independently, making decisions for herself. These moments symbolize freedom after decades of emotional confinement. The show beautifully captures how even ordinary experiences can feel revolutionary for someone who spent most of her life sacrificing her individuality. What made these arcs emotionally impactful was that Anupama was not becoming successful overnight. She was scared, hesitant, underconfident, and emotionally conditioned to think of herself as less than. Watching her slowly gain self respect, financial independence, and confidence became inspiring for many viewers, especially women, who saw their own suppressed dreams reflected in her story. But the problem is that the show gradually became trapped between empowerment and melodrama. Even after the divorce, Anupama was constantly expected to continue fulfilling responsibilities towards the Shah family, as if nothing had changed. The same people who ignored, insulted, and undervalued her still emotionally depended on her for everything. The family repeatedly expected her to solve their problems, cook for them, mediate conflicts, sacrifice her own happiness, and remain emotionally available at all times. This became frustrating for audiences because the show claimed to portray liberation, yet it rarely allowed Anupama to truly detach from the toxic environment that damaged her in the first place. Instead of fully moving to forward, she was continuously pulled back into the same cycle of emotional burden. The Shah family often became less than realistic characters and more like a permanent obstacle created to sustain the drama. Another criticism is the repetitive structure of her new beginning. The show repeatedly introduces a fresh chapter in her life, a new career, a new drama, a new dream, a new business, a new city, a new emotional journey, a new relationship, and a new opportunity. But before those arcs can reach emotional completion or meaningful achievements, they are interrupted by another crisis, another family conflict, or another dramatic twist. As a result, many viewers feel her growth never fully stabilizes. Her ambitions often become temporary plot devices rather than long term transformations. This creates a pattern where Anupama is constantly starting over, but rarely arriving anywhere permanently. The emotional satisfaction of seeing her genuinely success gets replaced with endless interruptions designed to keep the narrative running indefinitely. Another aspect audience increasingly noticed is that nearly every major turning point in her life eventually involves a supportive male figure. Whether emotionally, financially, or socially, the narrative often introduces a man who validates, protects, motivates, or rescues her journey. While characters like Anuj were loved by many viewers for genuinely respecting her, Some audience also questioned why the show repeatedly relied on male support as a catalyst for her progress. That criticism comes from the fact that the original appeal of Anupama was her discovering her own strength. When every new phase heavily depends on another supportive man entering the story, some viewers feel it weakens the message of independent self growth the show initially represented, because in real life, no woman will get a new man in every aspect or in every journey of her life. So, this seems a bit fake for the viewers to watch. And because the show runs daily and depends heavily on emotional intensity, the storytelling eventually becomes chaotic, constant screaming, repetitive family politics, emotional breakdowns, misunderstandings, endless sacrifices, sudden reveals, and never ending suffering. The emotional realism that once made the show relatable slowly turns emotionally exhausting. Instead of watching growth, viewers often feel like they are watching the same emotional wounds reopen repeatedly. Now let's briefly talk about the characters that gave the show a turning point. First one is Anuj Kapadia. He was introduced as the emotional opposite of Anraj, a man who saw Anupama's worth long before she herself could see it. What made his character deeply loved initially was the quiet patience and emotional sincerity attached to him. His love for her was one sided for almost 26 years, yet it was never shown as obsessive or demanding. He loved her from a distance, respected her life choices, and never expected anything in return. That emotional maturity made him stand out from typical ITV male leads. For many viewers, Anuj represented the idea of unconditional emotional support. He admired Anupama not for glamour or perfection, but for her kindness, resilience, and emotional warmth. When she was constantly insulted, neglected, and made to feel small by her family, he became the first person who genuinely valued her existence. He encouraged her dreams, invested in her confidence, supported her ambitions, and emotionally reassured her at every step. In many ways, he symbolized the life Anupama could have lived if she had been loved correctly from the beginning. Their relationship felt refreshing because it was not built on youthful attraction alone. It was built on emotional understanding, companionship, healing, and respect. That is why audience became deeply attached to both of their dynamics. After years of pain, viewers wanted Anupama to finally experience peace and love. But as expected, eventually the show started damaging his character as well. The adoption track involving Choti Anu became one of the most criticized turning points. Initially, the idea of them adopting a child suited the emotional warmth of their relationship and represented a new beginning for their family. But later, the storyline became increasingly chaotic and emotionally forced. The adopted daughter was written in a way that gradually created distance and resentment towards Anupama, often for reasons viewers found exaggerated or poorly justified. The problem was not that a child could feel emotionally conflicted. That can be realistic. The problem was how dramatically and suddenly the emotional dynamics shifted. Choti Anu's anger towards Anupama often felt narratively manufactured to create conflict rather than naturally developed through nuanced writing. And then came the biggest disappointment for many audience. Anuj himself turning emotionally against Anupama after the leap. The man who once understood her sacrifices better than anyone suddenly became another source of emotional pain and blame. For viewers who had seen him as her emotional safe space, this felt like a betrayal of the very foundation of his character. Their relationship, once the emotional healing center of the show, slowly turned into her exhausting cycle of, another exhausting cycle of emotional separation, misunderstandings, guilt, sacrifice, and suffering. Instead of allowing them stability and mature companionship, the writers repeatedly inserted emotional turmoil to sustain the drama. What once was comforting became emotionally draining. The tragedy is that Anuj was initially considered one of the strongest male protagonists of ITV precisely because he was gentle, emotionally expressive, supportive, and respectful. Qualities that rarely centered in traditional ITV masculinity, but later writing diluted those strengths for dramatic conflicts. The second character is that of Kavya. Kavya is one of the show's most complicated characters because she exposed a contradiction within the narrative itself. Kavya was independent, ambitious, financially secure, confident, and career oriented, traits that ITV often claims to celebrate. But the show initially framed many of these qualities negatively by associating her independence with selfishness, arrogance, emotional instability, and moral disruption because of her affair with Vanraj. This unintentionally reinforced a familiar ITV stereotype that the sacrificing homemaker is emotionally pure, while the ambitious working woman is disruptive or morally questionable. Even though she later received more layered writing and emotional vulnerability, the early portrayal created the impression that traditional domestic femininity was safe, while independent modern womanhood was threatening or destructive. This contrast became one of the more debated aspects of Anupama. The show wanted to promote women's empowerment, but at times it also relied on conventional moral binaries between the ideal homemaker and the career woman. And that is why the show remains so decisive. It genuinely brought important conversations about women's emotional labor, identity, divorce, remarriage, and self worth into mainstream television. At the same time, its repetitive melodrama, inconsistent character writing, and reliance on emotional chaos often weakened the very theme that made it groundbreaking initially. So, that was all. If you like my analysis, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you.